Hey everyone, my name is Loon. I'm a mixer, recording engineer, and artist from the greater Boston area. This video is the second in a mini-series that I'm doing on this channel where I go over all of the production techniques that I use to create the song Whiplash by Olivia Cloud. Now, that song was released on the Whiplash EP. That came out February 16th, and it's available wherever you get your music. I highly recommend you listen if you haven't yet, and if you have, thank you for listening. If you go on to enjoy this video, please hit the like button, and also while you're down there, hit the subscribe and the little bell icon so that you're notified when the rest of the series comes out over the next few days. So without further ado, let's hop into Pro Tools, and we'll talk about the drum mix and how I got the drum sounds for the song. So I have the drum mix here in these red tracks, and you'll actually see two sets of drums, and I'll talk about why that is a little bit later on. But first I wanted to talk about the process for recording them. These, even though they sound sort of similar to real drums, they're not actually recorded. These are MIDI drums, and actually it's one of the stock drum kits that comes with Logic. I forget which one exactly it is that I used, but I think they sound really good. Though it's worth saying I've done a fair amount to change the sound. Thankfully, more and more I think the stock kits in Logic are sort of getting the credit that they deserve. You know, if I can just reinforce that here. The stock Logic kits are really serviceable, even though I do use other drum libraries for different contexts. In terms of how I got them into Pro Tools as audio files, I just bounced out each kit piece separately. And then for every track except for the overheads, I just summed it down to mono. And you'll notice there aren't a whole lot of plugins on this. Part of that is because there's still some residual processing from Logic, things like very light compression. And because they're drum samples, they require less processing than a normal drum kit would require. But I'm still doing a couple things that I wanted to touch on that I did for particular reasons. On the individual channel strips, you'll see I went through a bunch of different options for the two kick drum tracks. First, an LA2A, because I just wanted to see what that would sound like on a kick. That's just a compressor. I have this EQ that was doing pretty insane stuff to this track, and then an 1176, but the Pro Tools 1176, and none of those ended up working. And so I went back to my sort of go-to plugin for drum processing, which is the original, or I believe the original SSL native channel strip. Now, this plugin, to my knowledge, it isn't available anymore, but there are newer versions, and it's really good. It's not cheap, but it's good. You'll see on this kick track, for instance, I have the compressor going, and then I'm doing some EQ moves, like a bit of a boost around 55 hertz. I'm pulling out some of the low mids, and then I'm boosting at 1.2K to get some click. I think the other one has a relatively similar thing going on. The two kick tracks together sound like this. There's a pretty good amount of low end punch to it, but also some click. The snare, actually, I'm doing roughly this, well, a similar thing, but I have a high passing gauge this time. Some compression, some EQ, a little bit of a high end boost, and a little bit of a low mid cut. I really like how this snare turned out. Oh, it's a really awesome sounding snare, considering that it is included in Logic. The two tom mics, I didn't end up doing a lot with them. I just compressed them with an 1176 because there's really only two tom fills in this song, and so I didn't spend a whole lot of time on them. They kind of sat pretty well by default. Hi-hat has a distortion on it. This is kind of acting like a saturator, if I'm being totally honest. Yeah, like it's a very minimal distortion, just adds a little bit of character to it. On the outro, again, I have a channel strip plugin. This one has the high pass filter all the way up at 500, and then I'm again cutting 600 about as much as I can with this plugin, plus some compression. That's because, as I mentioned in the guitar video from a few days ago, there's a lot going on in this outro section of the song, which is where these particular drum tracks are pulled from. It would be a real problem if I had like cymbal mix cluttering up the mids. So instead I just cut all of that out, and I got a I got an overhead track. So this is just crash cymbals. They sound really thin on their own, but again, like in the context of the whole mix, they're just that top layer of that we really want from crash cymbals without any of the stuff in the mids that's a problem. That's all that I'm doing to the individual drum tracks. It's really pretty simple, but the thing that I really think brings this drum sound together is what I'm doing on the drum bus, which we can see up here at the top. So I actually have a couple of drum buses that all of these things are being summed to. So the first is just the normal drum bus. This has an SSL native. This is I think their first bus compressor. So you can see it's based on the G comp. And I have the mix down a little bit to sort of emulate a parallel compression thing. This plugin ends up on basically all of my drum buses pretty much with these settings. And then I aim for like 3 to 4 dB of gain reduction for like rock and metal stuff. And I find it works really well. It just adds a little bit of, not to use a production buzzword, but it really glues the drum tracks together. And finally, on the drum bus, I just have a low cut. On the main drum bus, I have a low cut at 38 hertz, and that's just to reduce the low end buildup. Because of course, the low cut doesn't cut out every little bit of signal that's there. It's a pretty steep roll off, but really, you don't need much under 30 hertz in a mix like this. So that's pretty intentional to just like keep that area not muddy. The thing that really made this drum sound though is this parallel drum bus, which I call the drum distortion bus. And so this again has the bus compressor on it. This one, it's compressing it a lot harder, and actually it's more functioning as a limiter here. And the reason for that is that it's then going into Soundtoy's little radiator, which is preamp emulation, but I'm using it here as a distortion plugin for the drums. If I solo the drums and play through here, this is with that preamp engaged, and this is without it. The difference is pretty subtle. It adds some punch to the drums. And then again, as I said, I have a low cut and then a bit of a high cut. This is just to tamp down on some of the really extreme highs that can come from distorting something. And then finally, you'll notice that there is a reverb on these drums. But also then if you look at all of the drum tracks, you'll notice there's no reverb send anywhere, with the exception of the overheads, which have an extra drum verb. So the overheads have a bit of reverb on them. Everything else also has reverb, but no reverb tracks, and that is because I made a mistake when bouncing these out of Logic, and I included the reverb send that I had in that session, which was the demo track for this. And I did not realize that consciously until I was already mixing. So I had done all of the tracking for this, and I was just so used to the drum sounds that I was like, no, this sounds totally correct. And then I was mixing, I was like, wait, there's reverb on these, and I didn't put reverb on them. So yeah, there is reverb baked into some of these drum tracks, which is not the way you should go about things, but it ended up working here. I think it sounds good, even though there's now reverb going into compression, which is technically the wrong order to do things, which just goes to show that there is no wrong order to do things. The one last thing on here to note is that these earlier drum tracks, I've sort of toned them down a little bit. They're a little quieter, they're a little less punchy. I sound like this. And the only thing that's different about these other than the punchiness is that I'm actually replacing the snare in this one. I'm using Slate Trigger here, really just to supplement the snare that came out of Logic with something that's a little bit more woofy. And I have the mix at 42% so that some of the original snare comes through, but it's also being layered with a sample. So that's a pretty comprehensive walkthrough of everything that I did with the drum mix, but I wanted to talk about some overall theory and conclusions before I wrap up this video. A discussion of like MIDI drums and can they sound good? Because like obviously they can. We hear MIDI drums on things all the time, but this is a very particular context, and the rest of the song is very like analog acoustic feeling. And so one of my concerns going in with this was that the MIDI drums were going to sound robotic and bad. And they certainly have that slightly robotic quality. They're pretty quantized. I did screw around with the timings on a few of them, but one of the things that I did that really made a huge difference, and you'll hear this if you listen to the hi-hat track, is that all of these hi-hat hits are a little bit different. And that was very intentional. I actually went through and manually adjusted a bunch of them. No human drummer can be perfectly consistent. And so the best thing that you can do for your MIDI drums, being very intentional about where the strong beats are, goes a long way to making drum tracks that sound a little bit more real. You know, you can hear some of the hits in there are a little bit different, and you can see, even just looking at the snare waveforms, you know, all of these hits are different. If I had to say one thing to conclude this video, it's mess with the velocities of your MIDI drums. They'll sound a lot better. But in the end, all of these together in the context of the final mix sound like this, and I think it really ties the vibe of the song together. So that's all that I wanted to cover here. I hope you found this video helpful. Maybe you saw me doing a few things that might be helpful in your own music. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. And while you're down there, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and check the link in the description to listen to this EP wherever you get your music. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in a few days with the next video in this series. Have a good one.